Time since Karoline stepped onto the stage, Judge Andrew remained silent, hands folded on the podium. His expression had softened, not weak, but reflective. A seasoned man reevaluating the battlefield. Karoline didn't gloat. She simply stepped back, allowing the silence to speak. A student in the second row whispered, "Did she just say the judge saved her mom?" Another leaned forward, shaking his head. That flipped everything. Judge Andrew finally cleared his throat. "I didn't expect that." He admitted, "Didn't know I ever meant that much to someone." He paused, scanning the room. "That's the danger, isn't it? You serve for decades, hand down verdicts, and forget that behind each one is a human being who might carry your words forever." He looked directly at Karoline. "Your mother was one of the bravest witnesses I've ever seen. If I gave her strength, she gave me something." To conviction. Karoline nodded quietly. "You never know who's listening or who's learning from your choices." The moderator, clearly shaken, finally stepped in. "Perhaps we should open the floor to student questions," but no one raised a hand. The audience sat frozen, emotionally tangled between generations, legacies, and ideologies. Then a girl in the back, clearly nervous, stood up. "Miss Leavitt," she began, voice trembling, "how do you handle people who try to silence your story?" Karoline smiled gently. "I remember that I don't speak alone, that every time I stand my ground, someone else finds the courage to do the same." She turned to Judge Andrew, "And sometimes someone who thought they were your opponent turns out to be part of your foundation." Judge Andrew nodded slowly, his eyes glinting, spoken like someone who understands the weight of words. The crowd didn't erupt this time. It didn't need to. The moment itself had power behind them. A faculty member slipped out, already calling a local journalist. "You won't believe what just happened at the civic engagement seminar." And at that moment, Karoline Leavitt and Judge Andrew, once opponents, stood as equals, bound by a single shared truth: justice isn't just something you enforce, it's something you pass on. Later that evening, footage from the event had already begun circulating on social media. Someone had captured the exact moment Judge Andrew's voice broke, admitting that Karoline's mother gave him conviction. The clip was short, just 20 seconds, but powerful. By midnight, it had over 3 million views on X. The number legacy unfolded, trended worldwide. Conservative circles praised Karoline for her grace and emotional depth. Liberal commentators, many usually skeptical, acknowledged her strength in bridging generations. "That wasn't politics," one user wrote, "that was history speaking through her." Meanwhile, inside a quiet diner on the outskirts of DC, Karoline sat alone in a booth, sipping black coffee and rewatching the clip, not for vanity, for clarity. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "He remembered me. I'm crying, so proud of you." Karoline smiled, her eyes misting. Then another message popped up, this time from a Capitol Hill aide. "You just changed the conversation, Karoline. Be ready tomorrow. You're being quoted in tomorrow's Judiciary Committee meeting." She stared at the message for a moment, stunned. A personal moment of truth had turned into national momentum. At that same moment, in his quiet Virginia home, Judge Andrew sat in his study, holding an old photograph. It showed him younger and more rigid, standing beside a nervous witness, Karoline's mother, his wife. "Peaked in that young woman today. She shook you, didn't she?" He nodded slowly. "She reminded me of why I became a judge. Somewhere along the way, I forgot." His wife placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Maybe you were meant to forget so she could remind you." The next morning, Karoline stood in front of a camera at a Fox News studio, her cross necklace gleaming against her navy blazer. "Miss Leavitt," the anchor began, "the internet says you made a judge cry. What do you say happened yesterday?" Karoline didn't flinch. "I think the system remembered it had a heart. I didn't plan to confront a judge. I planned to defend my truth. But sometimes when you do that right, people surprise you." The anchor leaned back, nodding. "You just made history." Karoline knew better. History wasn't made in one day, but truth, it just needed one voice to echo. The air in the auditorium was heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. Karoline Leavitt sat back down slowly, her fingers curled tightly around the armrest of her chair, her breathing controlled but sharp. Across the stage, Judge Andrew looked visibly rattled, his shoulders no longer squared, his gaze lowered. For the first time in the entire evening, the silence in the room wasn't tense, it was reverent. What Karoline had just done wasn't merely a rebuttal, it was a masterclass in dignity and restraint forged through fire. But the night wasn't over. The moderator, sensing the shift in the room, leaned forward. "Judge Andrew," she said carefully, "you've heard Miss Leavitt's story. Would you like to respond?" He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. I've presided over hundreds of cases. I've worked in the justice system for decades, but perhaps I've forgotten how the system can sometimes silence people instead of protecting them." His voice was quieter now, stripped of the authority it once carried. "Miss Leavitt reminded me that courtroom dignity doesn't come from titles, it comes from truth." There was a light smattering of applause, but all eyes turned to Karoline, wondering what she would do next. She stood up slowly, her posture strong, her voice low. But unmistakably famed Judge Andrew, the system doesn't need perfect people, it needs brave ones willing to admit when they've missed something. Her tone wasn't angry now, it was resolute, laced with hope. I'm not here to win an argument, I'm here to make sure stories like my uncle's don't get forgotten. He needed someone to listen when he was silenced. I'm simply making sure that silence ends tonight. In the front row, a woman gasped softly, another dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A teenager leaned forward, recording with her phone. But most just sat still, moved not by spectacle, but by something real. Judge Andrew's lips parted slightly, his voice cracked. What happened to your uncle? I should have seen it, I should have acted. Karoline stepped closer to the edge of the stage, lifting her chin. Then start now, she said, not by apologizing to me, but by standing up for others who don't have a microphone or a title. Use your voice while you still have it. The judge slowly stood. The moment felt suspended in time. He turned to the crowd and said clearly, I will, and I thank you for reminding me how. The auditorium erupted in applause, not polite, not rehearsed, but raw and rising like a wave. Students stood, clapped, some even shouted her name. Karoline didn't smile for attention. She simply placed a hand over her chest where her silver cross necklace glinted and nodded once, quiet, composed, undeniably victorious. After the event, the university auditorium buzzed with emotion and energy. Students crowded the aisles, not rushing to leave, but lingering, trying to absorb what had just happened. Professors whispered among themselves. Journalists from campus media scrambled to jot down notes, and Karoline Leavitt, she stood quietly by the edge of the stage, surrounded by young people waiting to speak with her, not for autographs, but for something deeper, understanding. One young man stepped forward, clearly nervous. Miss Leavitt, he said, my brother's a Marine. He went through something like your uncle. No one believed him, but when you spoke, it was like hearing him. Karoline gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Then your brother's voice just got stronger. She said, tell him that and tell him to keep speaking. Moments later, Judge Andrew approached again, this time not as a challenger, but as a man. Changed. His suit looked the same, but something in his posture had softened. He extended a hand. You didn't just speak truth, he said, you restored something I didn't know I'd lost. Karoline shook his hand. Respect doesn't come from a bench, it comes from accountability, she replied. If you meant what you said on that stage, show it outside these walls. I will, he promised. Just as the conversation ended, her phone buzzed. It was a message from the White House Chief of Staff. We saw the video. It's everywhere. You just turned a lecture into a national moment. Be ready for the press. Karoline looked up, her expression calm but purposeful. She had walked into that room prepared to defend her honor, her uncle's story, and her conviction. She had expected to face hostility, maybe even silence. What she hadn't expected was to start a conversation that would echo beyond those walls. Later that evening, clips of her exchange with Judge Andrew flooded X and YouTube. One video titled Karoline Leavitt Shuts Down a Federal Judge with a Single Story gained 500,000 views in just a few hours. Commenters called her the voice of a generation, a force for truth, and the future of American leadership. But Karoline wasn't watching the numbers. She was in her car, driving home in silence, the silver cross around her neck catching the glow of passing headlights. Her thoughts were on her uncle and the promise she made to him in his final days to never let his voice be forgotten. And tonight she hadn't just remembered it, she had amplified it. The next morning, the ripple effects of Karoline's confrontation with Judge Andrew had grown into waves. Conservative news outlets declared her the night's moral victor. Liberal commentators, some reluctantly, acknowledged the power of her message, but the most striking reaction came from veterans groups across the country. Emails flooded her office. Messages from soldiers, Marines, and even retired generals poured in, thanking her for speaking a truth so many had been too afraid to share. One message signed simply, Sergeant J.P. read, I serve in Afghanistan. I saw things I still can't talk about. What you said last night about the silence after the service, it's real. You're one of the few who gets it, and that means more than you know. Move. Karoline typed back, personally, your service still echoes. Socket, I just held a MIC to the truth you already live. Meanwhile, university officials held an emergency meeting not because of outrage, but because of opportunity. The dean, once skeptical of her appearance, now said publicly, regardless of politics. Miss Leavitt reminded us that real debate includes personal experience, and that sometimes students learn more from one raw story than from 1,000 lectures. Across campus, posters appeared overnight quoting her final words to the judge, respect doesn't come from a bench, it comes from accountability. Students shared the clip, edited to music, across TikTok and Instagram. It wasn't just a viral moment, it was a cultural one, and yet in the midst of it all, Karoline stayed grounded. She returned to her office that afternoon and quietly placed a new item on her desk, a folded American flag passed down from her uncle's funeral. Beside it, she added a framed still from the moment she stood across from Judge Andrew, her hand midi, her face fame, her Words burning, her aide entered holding a note to producer. From CNN call, they want you on tonight. They say Judge Andrew already confirmed. Karoline didn't flinch. She looked at the cross she always wore, then at the flag. Tell them I'll be there, she said, and this time I'll be asking the questions. The CNN studio lights were colder than usual, casting a sterile glow on the set. Across from Karoline sat Judge Andrew, this time not in his robe but in a tailored gray suit. His face, usually composed, seemed a shade paler. He glanced at the cameras, then back at Karoline, who sat upright in a navy blue dress, the folded American flag pin shining on her lapel. The moderator began. But Karoline didn't wait. She turned directly to Andrew, her voice steady and precise. Judge Andrew, last night you tried to teach me about respect. Today I'd like to teach you something in return, about listening, about the silence you didn't acknowledge. Andrew blinked, clearly caught off guard. Miss Leavitt, no, she interrupted, calm. But fame, you said veterans shouldn't seek applause, but did you ever ask what silence cost them? She leaned forward, not in aggression, but in conviction. When I was 16, my uncle, U.S. Army, Afghanistan, came back home and never spoke of what he saw. He tried, we tried, but the silence became a wall, and one day that wall closed and the audience was still. Andrew didn't interrupt this time. Karoline continued, her voice softening. That's what silence does. It doesn't humble, it haunts. You don't have to clap for a veteran, but if they speak, you listen. That's not politics, that's decency. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Then she added, you're not the first person to hide behind robes and rules to shame others into silence, but that era is ending. America isn't built on silence, it's built on voices, even young ones. Judge Andrew lowered his gaze. For once he didn't rebut, he didn't smirk, he just nodded slowly. I was wrong, he said, barely audible. I thought I was honoring tradition, but maybe I forgot what it really means. Karoline nodded once. It's not about remembering the flag, it's about remembering the ones who carried it. The show ended in an unexpected silence, not tension but reverence. Online, the moment trended instantly. Voices that matter became the phrase of the night, and for the first time in his public life, Judge Andrew sent a handwritten letter the next day, not to a colleague, not to a court, but to Karoline Leavitt. Thank you for reminding me that even a judge must sometimes be judged. Days after the on-air confrontation, the ripple effects were undeniable. Networks replayed Karoline's speech alongside the moment. Judge Andrew quietly admitted fault, a rare moment of vulnerability from a man known for decades of unflinching authority in the White House press room. Karoline stood by the podium, her tone composed but charged with meaning. The silver cross on her neck rested gently over her navy blouse, gleaming under the lights. This week, a former judge tried to silence not just me, but the idea that youth has no place teaching wisdom. She began, her gaze steady. But we proved otherwise. Not because I shouted louder, but because I spoke truth, truth wrapped in personal memory and patriotism, in the kind of pain that too often goes unseen. Reporters watched intently behind the scenes. Her words were already being clipped, shared, and analyzed, but Karoline didn't speak for virality. She spoke for the ones who couldn't. I didn't plan to confront a courtroom legend, but when our stories are dismissed as noise, silence is not strength, it's surrender, and I won't surrender. That line echoed online within minutes. Later that evening, Judge Andrew sat alone in his den, surrounded by law books and old photos. On his desk was a small stack of letters, some of support, others of criticism, but one stood out, a handwritten note from a young veteran. Sir, I watch you listen. That meant more than you know. Thank you. It hit him harder than he expected. He picked up a pen and wrote back, sometimes being humbled is the beginning of wisdom. Meanwhile, Karoline received a message from a Gold Star mother in Missouri. Your voice spoke for my son, and for that I thank you. She framed it. The following week, Judge Andrew agreed to speak at a public forum on veterans voices in law, not as a judge, but as a listener. Sitting beside him on the panel, Karoline Leavitt. As they took their seats, Andrew turned to her, offered a quiet nod, and whispered, I came to teach, but I'm still learning. Karoline smiled faintly. So are we all. And in that moment, what began as a televised clash became something greater, a shared recognition that authority without humility is hollow, and that even an old judge can learn from a young voice with a story worth hearing. Sometimes it only takes one voice to challenge a legacy and one memory to change a mind. Karoline Leavitt didn't walk into that studio to win an argument. She walked in to speak for those who have been silenced, dismissed, or forgotten. And what happened next was more than a confrontation. It was a revelation. Judge Andrew believed his time had taught him everything, but Karoline reminded him and the world that wisdom isn't bound by age and truth doesn't always wear a robe. This wasn't just a story about a debate. It was a story about listening, about bridging generations, and about the power of showing up with courage when it would be easier to stay quiet, because when experience meets honesty and pride meets humility, Change becomes possible, and Karoline, she didn't just win the room, she awakened it. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of silence that only comes after decades of authority. Judge Andrew Whitmore, retired but still feared, stood at the edge of the auditorium stage at Georgetown University. His white hair was combed neatly back, his voice slow and commanding. Students leaned in as he recounted old cases, sprinkling them with warnings about today's unqualified loudmouths in politics. Then, almost as a throwaway line, he added, "Take that Karoline Leavitt girl, passionate sure but reckless now. Grasp of real justice." Backstage, Karoline Leavitt froze. She hadn't planned to be there. The organizers of the Youth Political Summit had invited her for a late afternoon Q&A session, not to sit through lectures, but when she heard Judge Andrew's name, she made time. The man had been on the bench longer than she'd been alive, and now he was calling her out publicly. She wasn't just a press secretary anymore. After months of defending the Trump administration, clashing with celebrities, liberal judges, and even former first ladies, Karoline had become a symbol of a new kind of conservative, unapologetic, aggressive, but deeply principled. She touched the silver cross necklace at her collar, took a breath, and turned to the staffer beside her. "Does he know I'm here?" she asked. The staffer, wide-eyed, shook his head. "No clue. Want me to pull you out?" Karoline smiled faintly. "Number, I think I'll stay." Judge Andrew's voice boomed again. "Real law isn't about feelings or Twitter trends. It's about precedent. It's about discipline. It's about people who've paid their dues." Karoline stepped forward into the side wing, now visible to the audience. A few heads turned, whispers rippled across the room. The judge didn't notice, yet the moderator nervous glanced between them. We're honored to have Karoline Leavitt in attendance," he stammered. "Perhaps she'd like to respond later." Karoline's eyes narrowed. "Number. Not later." She took a step forward, her heels clicking on the polished floor like a gavel striking wood. "Actually," she said, her voice steady, loud enough for the entire room, "I think now is the perfect time." Judge Andrew turned, stunned. The crowd held its breath. Karoline smiled, not with arrogance, but the calm resolve of someone who knew exactly what she was about to do. She wasn't here to yell. She was here to teach a master of the bench that he'd just challenged the wrong woman. Judge Andrew's eyebrows rose slightly, the only sign of surprise he allowed. "Well," he said slowly, his deep voice carrying a slight condescension, "Miss Leavitt, I didn't expect you to be here, certainly not on my stage." Karoline walked calmly to the front, each step deliberate, her eyes never leaving his. "I didn't plan to be," she said, stopping just a few feet from the podium, "but when I heard someone was using their retirement to lecture the next generation about why we don't belong, well, I couldn't stay silent." The audience stirred. Some students leaned forward, hungry for a clash. Others exchanged nervous glances. Judge Andrew folded his hands behind his back. "Miss Leavitt, I've spent 40 years defending the law. I've sentenced killers, protected victims, and upheld the Constitution. You've been in politics for, what, 2 years? What could you possibly teach me?" Karoline tilted her head, smiling lightly. "Maybe nothing, or maybe everything." That line hit the air like a spark. She stepped beside the judge, not behind him. "Equal ground." "You said law isn't about feelings. I agree, but it's also not about ego or titles. It's about truth. You were right about one thing: precedent matters. So let's talk about precedent." She turned to the crowd, her voice now commanding. "The First Amendment wasn't written for the comfortable. It was written for the bold, for people who say unpopular things. People like me. You call that reckless. I call it American." Applause broke out, uneven at first, then growing. Judge Andrew's eyes narrowed. "Boldness without wisdom is dangerous. You represent a generation that acts before it thinks." Karoline turned toward him, her tone cooling. "And your generation sometimes thinks so long it forgets to act." Silence. She let it hang before stepping back. "You see, Judge, I don't reject your experience. I respect it. I just don't believe it gives you a monopoly on truth." The audience murmured, sensing the tide turning. The judge looked at her for a moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "You've got fire, but let's see if that fire burns clean or just burns." Karoline smiled. "Let's." Judge Andrew leaned forward, gripping the edges of the podium. His voice dropped an octave, quieter but sharper, like a scalpel. "Instead of a hammer, you want to talk about truth, Miss Leavitt. Let me tell you one." The room grew still. Even the students checking their phones looked up. "In 1993, he began. I presided over a case that haunts me to this day. A young girl, 13 years old, testified against the man who had hurt her. The courtroom was packed. The defense tried to break her. She didn't flinch. At the end, she stood and said, 'Even if you don't believe me, I'll keep speaking.'" He paused. "We convicted the man, but that girl didn't just win her case. She reminded me why I took the bench in the first place, not to protect institutions, but people." Murmurs of agreement swept the auditorium. Karoline stood still, not interrupting. "I worry," Judge Andrew continued, turning to her, "that your generation uses the law as a sword, not a shield, that outrage matters more than justice, that every disagreement becomes a war." Karoline waited until he finished, then stepped forward again. "I've heard that story before," she said softly, "because my Mother told it to me she was that 13-year-old. Gerald, a gasp rippled through the room. Judge Andrew's eyes widened. She told me the judge was firm but fair, that he listened, that he made her feel seen. She never forgot your name. The silence deepened. Karoline took a slow breath. You said, I've only been around for 2 years, but I've been shaped by moments like that my entire life. So when I speak today, I don't do it to win a fight. I do it because someone like you once gave my mother her voice back. Judge Andrew's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Students leaned forward, utterly still. Karoline turned to the crowd. Experience matters, but legacy matters more. What you do today shapes who we become tomorrow. And if we forget that, we'll lose everything. A single student began clapping, then more. Within seconds, the entire auditorium echoed with applause, not for the clash, but for the unexpected connection. Judge Andrew looked at Karoline with something new in his eyes. Respect. The applause faded slowly, but the impact lingered. For the first